Good evening, everybody, and welcome to night 3 of the Texas Star Party. This is night 2 of the live stream, so thank you, Will and Courtney, for helping us spread the message here and get this out to the rest of the world who can't be here with us at the Texas Star Party. My name is Jon Talbot. I'm the president of the Houston Astronomical Society. Welcome, everybody, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, Jon Talbot. Jon is a world-renowned astro-imager and PIX Insight guru for Motion Springs, Mississippi. Jon has been attending the Texas Star Party since 2014. Jon took up the hobby of astrophotography in 2001. We've been at it for a while, haven't you? And has pursued photography of the night sky for the past 19 years using astronomical CCD and DSLR cameras. Jon has been using PIX Insight since its release in 2004 and has done PIX Insight presentations at TSP, NEAIC, Winter Star Party, Okie-Tex, and the Mid-South Star Days, as well as writing a year-long PIX Insight series for amateur astronomers. He has had numerous images published in Sky and Telescope, Astronomy, and Amateur Astronomy magazines. He's also done multiple equipment reviews for Astronomy magazine. His most recent article, published in Sky and Telescope, was How to Optimize Imaging for Suburban Locations. Jon has a backyard observatory in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and photographs the night sky there and across the country at dark sites. Since retirement, he has been active in teaching astrophotography techniques at various star parties across the central and southeast U.S. His images can be viewed at his website, starscapeimaging.com. Did I get that right? Okay. Jonathan is the retired chief flight meteorologist for the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, better known as the Hurricane Hunters, located in Keesler AFB in Biloxi, Mississippi. He retired in 2016 after 34 years of service. He has over 5,600 flying hours and 153 hurricane penetrations, which provide critical data to the National Hurricane Center in Miami, Florida. Jon was active in promoting hurricane awareness during many trips to the Caribbean nations. He was the main project manager for the development of the Step Frequency Microwave Radiometer, which is an instrument carried on reconnaissance aircraft to remotely measure wind speeds on the ocean surface. So with that, I'd like to introduce tonight's guest, Mr. Jon Talbot.
Good evening. I hope you can hear me okay? Not too loud? Okay. The Britney Spears headset is kind of weird. I can't hear myself, so. Anyways, good evening. I want to thank the Texas Star Party staff for inviting me here to talk to you guys tonight. And how many imagers do we have in the room? Figured we'd probably have mostly imagers, and I know we have some visual folks. Well, this is basically an imaging talk, but hopefully maybe you'll get into it someday. You'll know about some of this stuff. What I'm going to talk about is basically how to determine how long you need to expose for when you shoot through a telescope. And so you think it's an easy question, but people ask all the time. You know, they do something at home, and they hear where you have a really dark sky. Oops. Oh, I thought I went away. We have a really dark sky here, and it's different. So how do you figure all that out? You know, maybe after you leave here, you go someplace else, and the sky's a little different. So that's what this talk is all about. After this, I've got a presentation that I'm going to go over kind of an extra thing about some interesting how us amateurs can help professionals. And I've been very, very lucky to work in that area a little bit for the last few years. And then a nice little slideshow at the end to kind of pump you up and go look at something if it clears out. So, anyways, okay, so we'll get going. So how do we typically image? Well, normally, our cameras are collecting photons from the sky, right? And our eyes are collecting photons when we look through a telescope, through an eyepiece. Well, our cameras do the same thing. And the brighter those photons are, or the more of them we have, the brighter our image is. So, if our cameras were perfect, right? So if we had an absolutely perfect camera, and we had a constant stream of photons coming down from the sky, we could shoot, say, a single image for like an hour, right? Say we took an hour-long exposure and we collected 1,000 photons in our camera. Say that's how it worked. Well, if we shot a 1-minute exposure 60 times for that same hour, we'd still be collecting 1,000 photons. If we shot maybe 6 10-minute exposures, we'd still be getting 1,000 electrons. So, as you can see, you know, would you rather do an hour-long exposure or a 1-minute exposure? Can everybody's telescope track for an hour? Well, the problem also is our cameras aren't perfect, right? Nothing is perfect. Photons don't arrive consistently, they're very random. They're like raindrops. You know, I can be standing here and a raindrop can hit me on the head, and somebody over here gets no raindrop on their head. So they're just not consistent. The electron count, which is photons get turned into electrons by a chip on your phone, the little camera in here, the little camera in our telescope, the camera, maybe you have a webcam at home looking out at something. Those photons that come into that get turned into electrons. And in the end, the quality of our image is really how many photons did we collect that got converted to electrons. And the more of those things we have, the brighter our image is. So, you know, if you use your cell phone outside and take a picture now, it's going to look really good. If you go out after dark, the picture won't look very good, right? You get enough photons in it to act, you know, to really be processed by the electronics. So it's all about photons. So why don't we take our exposure? Well, chances are that something is going to ruin that exposure. There's a lot out of our control when our telescope is doing its thing. Maybe a cloud will come over. Maybe something else will happen. So I think it'd be much better maybe if we took maybe 61-minute exposures. If a cloud goes over through one of those, it's not going to mess anything up in the big scheme of things. So there's a lot of stuff out of our control on a really, really long exposure. So what we do as astrophotographers is we take shorter exposures. And those are less likely to get ruined, and it allows us to approach what we could do if we took a single long exposure. So the other problem we have is not every photon gets counted, because these chips, certain chips are more sensitive than other chips. And there's a thing called quantum efficiency. This says, well, how efficient is our chip? If our quantum efficiency is 50%, 50% of those photons are going to be turned into something like electrons that can go into our computer and be counted and be, you know, shown as an image. Well, quantum efficiency is a big deal, and that's, you know, there's a whole bunch of different types of sensors out there and different types of cameras. So the quantum efficiency really depends on the actual sensor, and that changes. So that's one problem we have. We also have a problem with noise. Thermal noise and random noise adds electrons like photons do to what we see. We usually take care of this thing called thermal noise by cooling our cameras. That's why we have a cooler on the astronomical cameras that cool the chips down, because it reduces that significantly. And for the most part, that's easy to take care of. We just turn the cooler on, and we're done, and then we do our stuff. However, there are other sources of noise, and I highlighted the two most important ones. One is read noise, and one is shot noise. And those are bits of random noise that really mess up detail in an image. Read noise is really, you know, how accurate our little converter, what's called an analog to digital converter on the chip, that takes that photon and says, okay, now you're an electron. Some are more accurate than others, and that creates noise, and it's camera dependent. And then we have what's called shot noise. Shot noise all depends on what comes out of the sky. So if you're like me, and like probably 80% of the other people that live in maybe a suburban area, maybe I've got a World 5 sky, shot noise is not good for us if we're looking through an eyepiece, right? Our eye gets a lot of that shot noise. It's called light pollution. It's very, or, you know, everything is dimmed down in the sky. So it's a sky-dependent thing, and it can be taken care of, and I'm going to show you how. Here, the shot noise is very, very low, but the sky's dark. So, yeah, so those are the types of noise we typically see. And let's take a look at kind of what we use. So there is a little bit of a difference between a CCD and a CMOS camera. A CCD, which is called a charge couple device, basically works by taking in those photons and then closing the shutter, and then all those photons get read out at one point, and it goes to a converter that converts those into electrons, and then it goes to our computer. And we have a picture in front of our face on the screen. They're typically very expensive to produce, and the bigger problem is they're not being produced much anymore. The two big companies that have produced these, Sony and ON Semiconductor, have basically stopped a lot of CCD production. And that's where us amateurs get a lot of our cameras from. So recently, in the past 5 or 10 years, CMOS cameras have become very, very popular. These work a little bit differently. A CMOS camera has one of those little analog to digital converters on every little pixel. So if you have a camera with 10 million pixels, there's 10 million of those little converters on that chip. And that creates a little bit of extra heat, a little bit more problems, but manufacturers of these chips have figured all that out in the past 3 to 5 years. And now they are very, very good in comparison to CCDs. They are less expensive to make, they use a lot less power. They're in about every device you can think of. CMOS chip in here. Everything you can think of, maybe a car sensor that sees that you have in your car, home sensors for systems, they're all CMOS cameras. And CMOS cameras are basically the thing to have right now because all the money in R&D and development is going into these things. So why has there been this huge move? Well, it's basically money, and it's basically because in the CMOS market, the market was valued at about $17 billion in 2020. And if you look at CCDs, it's about $2 billion. Now, there are still CCDs being produced. Some of them are very, very good. They're super expensive. And if you want a $20,000 camera, you can easily get one that has the same performance as a high-end CMOS now. But a CMOS, you can pay $3,000 or $4,000. So, which one would you rather buy? So anyways, we are what we are. We have a lot of CMOS cameras out there now that are very, very good. The way the technology works, over on the left, the original CMOS cameras had the analog to digital converter above where the light-sensitive portion of the chip was. So on top, you see these red, green, and blue things. Those are micro lenses that focus the light down onto the chip. And had to go through those little of electronics, so you lost some signal. Well, the new thing that they've done over the last 2 years is created a chip called a BSI chip, backside illuminating chip, which was developed during the CCD days, and there was a great back illuminated CCDs, but they've done this with CMOS cameras now, so all the electronics are underneath the light-sensitive portion of the chip, and that allows all the light going in to be focused on the chip, and has raised that thing called quantum efficiency, how good they are, into the 90% level with the current generation CMOS compared to about 50% with the last generation of CCDs for amateur astronomers. So that is a huge improvement. That means they're much, much more sensitive. And that's kind of how they work. So I first got involved with CMOS here at the Texas Star Party in 2019. I was thinking about getting one of these cameras, and I just had gotten a new telescope, and I had my an older CCD camera, and I walked around on the upper field, and I was talking to people that had CMOS cameras, and most of them were young kids at the time. And the reason was the cameras were very inexpensive. They couldn't necessarily afford $8,000 for a CCD. They could buy a $1,200 CMOS camera sticking on the back of the scope. So the young generation were the kind of pioneers to get these cameras going and producing some really good astronomical images with them. Most of the folks I talk to love the low read noise in these cameras. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Read noise is everything in this game. Higher the read noise, the less you really can see and the more grainier images. And CMOS cameras have super, super low read noise. But we had other things going on. Some of the cameras then had amp glow, which was like this, some of the early DSLRs had it too. After you took an image at night, like long exposure, you'd see this glow in the corner of the image. Well, that was produced by those little amplifiers on every pixel. Well, that isn't solid, that's gone. So, but those were some of the concerns that folks had, and I just happened to attend the Advanced Imaging Conference in San Jose that year, 2019 was the year, and QHY introduced this camera called the QHY 600. And I listened to their presentation, and the specs on this camera were better than anything I'd ever seen with any of the CCD you had a chance to use. Quantum efficiency was up around 90%. The read noise using what's called high gain was down around 1.5 electrons. And the dark current was 10 times less than any CCD camera. So anyways, I was really interested about that. I was like, I couldn't believe it. And just after that, ZWO announced their SI6200, which is the camera I ended up buying. This is basically the same chip. The electronics were a little different. It was a little bit less expensive than the 600. It had a few less features, But it was basically the same camera, the same electronics. So I looked at it on the user forums. I somehow had to come up with an excuse to my wife for why I should spend money and buy a new camera. And that worked. And so I got one of these cameras in July of 2020, put a bunch of filters in it, and off we went. And I did a lot of testing and stuff and so forth. So this is a graph that or a table that shows how the IMX 455, which is in this particular camera, compares against some of the CCDs that are out there. And I included the last generation of CCDs, the 16200. So this camera has very small pixels, but the quantum efficiency is much better. It has a very low read noise. It has very good well depth, which well depth is how many electrons can each one of those pixels hold, or how many photons that they turn into electrons can they hold. And it was very, very comparable. The difference was it was much more sensitive, and the read noise was super, super low. So, and of course the dark current, which is comes from the heat, was like 10 times less than a CCD camera. So, and less expensive. So it was a good deal. So, if you get one of these cameras, these new CMOS cameras, and you get into imaging, there are things that you have to do. And if you don't do these things, you can just plug it in and take some pictures, see how it comes out. But if you want to determine how well your camera works, and is it working up to the specs that the manufacturer says it does, you have to characterize your system. It's fairly a simple process. You take 2 flat frames, 2 dark frames, 2 bias frames, and then you run it through a script. Say, I know PixInsight has a script for it. You can Google characterizing a CCD camera. You can find a bunch of different ways to do it. They all come up with the same number, but something that has to be done because you need to know a couple of things when you try to figure out what your exposure tracks would be. You need to know what your read noise is of your camera. And if it's a CCD, you should go to the manufacturer, or you can figure it out yourself and doing it this way. You need to know what your sky is like. You need to know what your well depth of your camera is. So you need to know a few of these numbers in order to put them into this little tiny equation I'm going to show you here in a minute and figure this out. So I characterize mine. This is just a dark frame, which is a kind of a thermal frame from a camera. There's no glow. If you notice on the side, say the right or left side, there's no real light glow sticking out. So the amp glow was basically gone, and that's one of the things that the manufacturers were very successful at doing. The camera linearity, how linear is the camera? If I take longer exposures, does something go wonky? And with these new cameras, they are extremely linear. This process can be done using several methods. I use the ESO method, American Association of Variable Star Observer method, because they have their own method and they use these cameras to do photometry with. And I used their method and it came out a perfectly straight line. It was really good. I also sent my data to a gentleman named Adam Block, so that you know him. He's a world-renowned astrophotographer. He teaches lots of courses, has lots of videos online. So he has custom software that he ran it through, and in the end it came back, did an upper left graph. Yes, it's a really linear camera. But it did have a little issue in the second panel down on the left. In the really super low levels, it's a little wonky. So, but it's really nothing that affects anything you do when you image unless you're going after stuff that is like super faint. So, all those tests were good, and I would expect you to see the same thing with any of the new cameras that are out there now, from the two most popular, the QH wire, the ZWO cameras. They have really, really good electronics, and they've done a really good job at putting these cameras together. So the other thing, you have to take a couple flat frames. Flat frames just basically show the illumination through your telescope system. Your system, I mean telescope camera, maybe you have a field flattener or a corrector in there. And it also shows you where these things called dust motes are on there. And it's a way to, when you calibrate images, it gets rid of a lot of other issues, right, with your system. So the CCDs, when we used to take these things called flat frames, if you bid your camera, meaning instead of exposing with a single pixel, now you can make it 4 pixels, and it's called 2x2 bidding, with a super pixel, and take an image a lot more sensitive. With a CCD, it's like 4 times more sensitive when you bid. With a CMOS, that's not the case, and I didn't realize that, so this one threw me for a loop. These are 2 images. The one on the left was taken with what's called 2x2 bidding, making that super pixel, and I expected a much brighter image. Well, it didn't happen. The other one on the right is the 1x1 original shot, and they both had the same value, and I'm like, I can't figure out what's going on here. So I got hold of my friend, good friend Richard Wright, which I think is here. He's here at the Star Party, and he got a hold of ZWO, and we found that ZWO averaged these pixels instead of the way CCDs work. CCDs you add together. ZWO averaged them. So that was good, but I just didn't expect that. So if you're a person that uses a CCD and you're going to buy a CMOS camera, be prepared for this. If you get a 2HY camera, you have the option of either adding or averaging. ZWO just does the averaging, but it makes no difference in the world. It's just another way to manipulate the numbers. So what are the numbers? Well, the important things when you characterize a camera, this is a script within the program called PixInsight. Like I mentioned, there are other ways to do this, and you can do the research out here to find those other ways. It's readily available. The numbers that we need to know, upper left, where I have the arrows. So in this case, the read noise is shown, the dark current is shown, and the full well capacity. And how many electrons can I stick in that chip? Well, when I went through this, the camera performed exactly like the manufacturer said, so I knew it was good to go. And I had the numbers now, so now I can figure out how long do I need to expose with. So this was it's always a good feeling. If you get a camera and the numbers aren't the same, well, maybe you need to send that camera back because they should be what's listed on their website. So noise. Noise is what makes your image look like this. So maybe if you took a picture with your camera outside at night, maybe you get a really grainy image back, right? That looks like this. Well, what happens if the noise goes down? And as astrophotographers, the general rule of thumb is you want about 5% noise, at least 5% read noise compared to all the other sources of noise. This is a lot higher than that. This is probably 20-30%. But as you get less noisy image, let's watch what happens here. So the noise has gone down, it's gone down even more, it's gone down even more, and oh look, these really faint things are starting to show up, and things are getting more and more sharp, and read noise goes down, and wow, now what? So this is what 5% noise looks like, and this is read noise compared to all the other noise in your system. And now we can see a real tiny, say a little tiny red blob, it's a little star, and we can see this cool grid pattern on the side. Well, that's low noise. That's what you should shoot for. So as you can see, noise, if you have a lot of noise, you have no detail, right? The detail is gone. And if you get into really, really low noise, you get the detail back. And that's what it looks like when you have really low noise levels. Actually, that's the last one. So that's what you should strive for. And the reason why we can do this now is because of the advent of these very super low read noise cameras. My CCD was about like this, and I've used 4 or 5 different types of CCDs and so forth. This is about the noise level they produce. This is more like what you get now with these really low noise cameras. So let's talk a little bit about noise, and I'm going to apologize up front. I'm going to have to throw a couple equations up here, but for you astro-imagers, this is stuff that you're going to want to know and remember. So there's a few definitions, I'm not going to go through everyone, that's what they need. So the two types of noise that we have to deal with is read noise and shot noise. So that's what they are. The read noise is the random problems we get with our analog to digital converter in the camera, and shot noise is because these photons we get from the sky arrive randomly. And maybe I'm in a bright sky and I get less of the photons I want, more of the photons I don't want. Or maybe I'm here at TSP and I have a really dark sky, but those photons are still coming in very randomly. So it depends on this value called sky flux. And sky flux is just a cool way to say maybe how much light pollution is in the sky, right? That's probably an easier way to say it. So, those are the three little things. You don't have to write them down because I'm sure you can get this at a later date and you can see it because it's being recorded. You can also see it on the Astro-imaging channel on the AIC website. There's three little equations up there that basically explain what the noise is all about and how to figure out which noises in each image. But we need to know a couple things. And what the equation that's down there are, the R squared. That's our read noise. So we figured that out, right? When we did that little camera test to figure out what our camera was really like. We figured out what that R was. We know how long our total imaging time or our sub-exposure length typically is. We know how many subframes we took, which is how many images we took with that, say, filter. We know the read noise. Now we need to know what is the shot noise. How do we figure out the sky flux? So there's a cool way to do it. There is Dr. Robbie Glover, who was the developer of SharpCat. Anybody here use SharpCat? Yeah, he is a really, really sharp individual. He developed this little application. It's the one on the right-hand side. It's an online app that allows you to figure out the sky flux wherever you are. It works absolutely perfectly. And I believe it's tools.sharpcat.co.uk. Yeah, so there's a link up there for that. You can also do this using like PixInsight or maybe other applications that are for imaging can provide you with this information also. So there's more than one way, but that's the easiest way to do it. And you can do this at home before you can go someplace, which is the cool thing, is you can figure all this stuff out before you can show up here at a start party or something. You need to know how bright the sky is, maybe, or you can just say, hey, what's my world level? You put that value in there. You need to know the F ratio of your telescope. You need to know your pixel size, which isn't hard to figure out. You should know what that is. You go to the manufacturer website. You need to know how efficient that camera is, the quantum efficiency. Remember that other value I was talking about, how sensitive is the camera? You can get that from the manufacturer. And you need to know what filter you're using. You put those numbers in, and boom, it comes out with a number at the bottom. And in this case, it says 0.19. That's electrons per pixel per second that's coming down from the sky. And this is a typical, this is a dark site like here, maybe a 21.5 sky. So you have that number. It's an easy way to get it. You just go to the online app to do it. Well, once you have that number, you have this little formula, and if there's anything you remember, for those of you that are interested, remember that little formula right there. That is the whole key behind this. This value C times R squared over P. R is read noise. We know what that is, right? P is this sky flux that we're getting from the sky. We just got that from that little online app, right? And then we have a value called C. C relates to how much noise you are willing to accept when you take your images. I mentioned 5% is the typical value. Well, C is equal to 10 at 5%. So, now I got all three numbers. I take that 10 times whatever the read noise is, divided by the value I got, and that gives you an exposure time. And it works perfectly all the time. And it's, you're using the online app, you can plan this before you can go someplace. So if you take away anything from this, remember that way of doing it. And this was developed by Dr. Glover, and I've tested it over and over and over again against other methods, and it comes up with the exact same answer compared to other ways. And there are other ways to do this, but this is a very, very simple way. And you came all the way to Texas just to hear that. So there is another way which is really, really good. It's produced by the Gibraltar Astronomical Society. It's called a sub-exposure calculator. You can find it online. It'll download to your computer as sort of a workable PDF type file, and you put in basically the same numbers. You need to know your read noise. You need to know the dark curve of your camera, which you got from that test that you did. You need to know a little bit about your background. You know, how many what values you get in the background, which you can get from that online calculator. And you plug the numbers in, and it comes up with basically the same answer. This thing was developed years ago, and it's amazing that it came up with the same stuff. This was done by, everybody knows Steve Canistra. He's from the Boston area. He did a lot of work on this with those folks, and they did a great job. Bottom line, math is math. And you do math one way, you do math the other way, and you come up with the same answer. So this is just another way to do it. If you're interested to check that out, you can. So here's a little example I'm going to go through. This is a AF16200. This was the last CCD that was really put out there for us astrophotographers. The camera averages about 50% quantum efficiency, so it has 6 micron pixels, and typically what we want to get down to about 5% read noise, compared to 5%, our read noise is 5% of our total noise in an image. And we're going to do this, we're going to calculate that sky flux using the SharpMap way, using that little online calculator I showed. So, say we took a 60-second exposure, and the background sky flux happened to be this value here of 0.71 electrons per second. So our total sky flux is our time, 60 seconds times that. It's this value of 42.6 electrons per pixel. And now I look at those equations again. This thing called single frame photon shot noise is that equation there. If you plug the numbers in, that's what you get, 6.53 electrons per pixel. So our idea is, how much read noise do we add into the total shot noise of that image? Well, it ends up, you can run another little equation I had, plug some numbers into it that you already have, and you come up with this value of 3.04 electrons per pixel. So what percentage of read noise was added to this thing called photon shot noise? And in this case, it's 32%. I don't want 32%, I want 5%. 32% was that grainy image that I showed you earlier. I want a nice smooth one. So, but that, remember, this is a very short exposure. This is a 60-second exposure. So, if I wanted to get down to 5%, I'd have to shoot with this camera for 690 seconds in a place like here where it's really dark, using that particular. So that's a little over 10 minutes. And that's exactly what I used to have to do. About 10-minute exposure when I was there with the CCD camera. It worked out great. Well, the numbers don't lie, and they say, yeah, that's what you should have been doing. Well, this is the latest generation CCD, and it's all because this camera has higher read noise. That's why you have to shoot camera all the time. If we look at the example, this is the IMX455 chip, and we're going to do the exact same thing with the exact same numbers. We shoot for 60 seconds. My sky flux is a little bit different, but that's the value. I'm going to go running through these equations, and in 60 seconds, sorry, there we go. So in the end, in 60 seconds, I got down the percentage of read noise, which is added to the total noise, was 5%. So now I'm in that smooth-looking image area with only a 60-second exposure. And the reason is because this camera has read noise that is super, super low. Down in the 1 to 3 electron range versus 8 to 15 electrons with a CCD. It's all about read noise. And maybe that's what I should have named the presentation. It's all about read noise. So that's a benefit to using one of these new cameras. This is just a little spread, I put some numbers in a spreadsheet. If you had an F6 scope, a lot of people do, you're in a rural box, you're in the sky, how long do you need to shoot for to get this low noise stuff? Well, down here in the yellow at the bottom, you need to shoot for 8 seconds. That's all. People say, it'd be 8 seconds. That's not enough time. You need to shoot for 8 seconds. You need to shoot for 90 seconds, you have that CCD that I just talked about. If you're here at World Wide Sky, like maybe here in Fort Davis, you have to shoot for 53 seconds, about a 60-second exposure with the CMOS camera. With the CCD, 598 seconds, so 10 minutes. And that was typically what we always did when we came to places like this. We shot for 10 minutes. So that's just to show you, don't worry about the stuff other than it's there to show you the difference between the two cameras and how read noise affects how long you need to shoot for. So here it's 60 seconds. With the older technology cameras, about 10 minutes. Now, narrowband is a little bit different. Narrowband filters, depending upon the bandwidth of the filter, like HA filter, hydrogen alpha filter, or a oxygen 3 filter. And who imagers know what I'm talking about there? Yeah, you gotta shoot longer, and you may have to shoot for up to 20 minutes. But in the past, with older camera, you never got that low read noise with the narrowband filters. Now you can with these new cameras. This basically shows you if I shot an image, or I shot exposure, how long would my exposures need to be before I got to the point where if I shot any longer, it would make zero difference in the end result of what I got. With a CCD in a suburban sky using an F7 telescope, about 4 minutes. Okay, after 4 minutes, there's no reason to shooting longer. Nothing's going to get any better. With CMOS camera, or at least with the IX455 camera, which is very similar to all the other ones that are out there, your chip, you get no benefit after 60 seconds. So, would you rather shoot for 60 seconds or 240 seconds? Can your mount track well for 60 seconds? How about can it track well for 5 minutes? You have nice round stars? Maybe not. This is just a comparison I did at home between one of my old CCDs and the new camera. Basically, it was, I had to shoot the old camera to get down to that 5% read noise level at 340 seconds out of my house, which is a brighter sky, light polluted. But with the new camera, it was like 80 seconds. That was it. So, much more efficient. So, lastly, now I'll talk a little bit about dark frames. And these are those frames you use to calibrate your camera. And there's a lot of discussion about whether you need to take darks or not take darks. When you image, with the new cameras, the new CMOS cameras that are backside illuminated, here's an example on the left of a single 3-minute subframe that was only calibrated with what's called a bias frame, which is just a frame to show just the noise. It's a 0-second exposure, as low as you can get. And with these cameras, it's not necessarily 0, but it's like microseconds long. And then on the other side is an image that was calibrated with a real dark frame, which got rid of the thermal noise and everything. Well, you can hardly see the difference between the two. Can anybody tell which one is better than the other? They're both exactly the same, and the noise level is exactly the same in both of them. Here's a stack. This is like a stack of 3 minutes. This is 30 3-minute subframes stacked together, so 90 minutes of exposure time on the left. That was calibrated with just this noise frame called a bias frame. Then on the right is the same exposures, but they've been calibrated the normal way that these science cameras are calibrated with dark frames and everything else. And there is hardly any difference at all. So, if you use one of these cameras, you can probably get by without using dark frames if you don't want to, but you need to test it. You need to, convince yourself that it's actually true. And your camera could be a little bit different than my camera, but with mine, I don't necessarily have to. Now, if I really want to get something that's super, super faint, well, I'm just going to do it the normal way. But this is just to show you that these new cameras are very, very low noise. They're very good at keeping everything that you see in there is actually real stuff, not the stuff that makes an image green. Okay. inning, this is just about inning. What I will tell you is, people that have one of these, they talk about gain. What gain should I set my camera at? Well, this graph here shows you what happens when these cameras go from low gain to what's called high conversion gain. High conversion gain, on the bottom graph, the third step out, happens when you change the gain to this, in the ZWO case, to gain 100. The read noise drops like a rock. That is the point you want to use your camera at, this low gain conversion point. If you have a QHY camera, it's going to be a different value and a different, slightly different spot. It's going to be there. Some people say, well, if I do that, I'm going to saturate everything. If you use the right exposure time, you will. So, I've been able to prove that over and over again. So, look for this thing called high conversion gain, and in this case, the read noise drops way down to about an electron and a half. So, here's some things from the manufacturers that they recommend. The only time I think I would say don't use high gain is maybe if you're shooting something really super bright like M42 or something, and you want to preserve everything that's in the core of that thing, then you may want to mix and match a little bit, but 99% of all my imaging is done using high conversion gain. So what about short exposure imaging? Well, this is a pretty good example. This is an example of a galaxy called NGC 4395. It's in Canes Venatici. It's a 10th magnitude low surface brightness galaxy. This is a 2-hour exposure, 2 hours with LRGB, luminance, red, green, blue, and then I added some hydrogen alpha to show the emission regions a little bit. This was done using high gain on the camera. It was binned 2x2. I had a read noise of about 3 electrons with this. I took a bunch of exposures that were 60 seconds long using an F8 telescope. This was in a dark site in Florida, where it was as dark as here, but it was about 21.6, 21.8. I basically took a bunch of 60-second exposures and put them together. This was the result. And I'm thinking, man, 60 seconds, I don't have to guide, I don't have to, the mount tracks perfectly. I get nice sharp stars. The scene doesn't necessarily mess it up as much, or little mount variations don't mess it up. I ended up with 400 subframes, and the issue doing something like this is not the camera, it's the computer you have. If you buy one of these new high-tech cameras, you better be ready to upgrade your computer. If you're stuck with Windows 7 on a Pentium 2, it's just not going to work. So, but you get a really super good result. So this is, this was really interesting. Here's 60 seconds of hydrogen alpha. Has anybody get 60 second HA exposure before as a user? So, on the left is 180 60-second exposures. On the right is 9 20-minute exposures, which is my typical exposure time that I shoot HA in. Can you see the difference between those images? Much different. The only difference is in really the super faint levels. Oh, yeah, it's too big. It's your fault. You put the screen up, so. But in the end, when you look at these, there's almost no difference except in the really low levels. That's amazing. And the only reason this is even possible now is because of the low, read noise of these new cameras. So, in the future, here's the final result of that image, and again, no exposure was longer than 60 seconds here. I could have gone even shorter. So, now that I'm here at the Texas Star Party, if we have a beautiful night, guess how long I'm going to shoot most of my exposures, at least in red, green, blue? 60 seconds. I don't need to go any longer. And I don't need a guide, I don't need to basically do anything. We'll just track this fine. So some people said, yeah, it couldn't be done, but it could be done. And my friend Richard Wright and I, we tested this guy at his place with the images in Florida, and he was doing his own thing with the short exposures. And I said, yeah, I'll do the same test that you're doing. Sure enough, it worked really, really well. So he was absolutely right. He kind of gave me the idea of this, and it turned out really well. So the takeaways of all this, Back-illuminated CMOS performance is definitely, hands down, better than any CCD that you could have purchased as an amateur a few years back. There's much lower read noise, 3 to 10 times lower, much higher quantum efficiency, and excellent how many electrons can fit that pixel. They do have small pixels, so they are more suited to moderate-sized instruments, but if you have a bigger aperture scope, you sure you can bin that those pixels with good results. Maybe you do have to use darks, maybe not. I'm thinking that you can buy without using them if you don't want to. The quantum efficiency maximum is up around 90% in these new cameras, so they're much more sensitive. And some scientific CMOS cameras now are up to 95% QE. So the last takeaway is you can use very, very short exposures using that method I showed you, C times R squared over B. And you can get really, really super nice images by taking a bunch of substrates and putting them together. So, yeah, that's the bottom line. So, this was some stuff that Richard was going to do, and he publishes the Sky Telescope. As the read noise, you can get slower, and it will get lower. It won't be very long, it'll be below 1 electron. As the quantum efficiency gets better and better, it will, to 100%. The future of astro-imaging is going to be similar to the way planetary imagers do it now. Very, very short, quick, super short exposures. You're going to take 10,000 of them a night, your computer's going to automatically stack it together, and output at the end a really nice image. And, you know, when Mark Richard, our word that you wait 5 to 10 years, you'll be doing it like that. It's getting that good. So you may need a 3 petabyte drive pretty soon to hold all these things. However, I've got a 17 terabyte drive at home that I put my images on. There was nothing like that available 5 years ago, you know. Maybe they were just starting to come out with those, but I had to spend thousands and thousands of dollars. So now I go spend $100 and I got a 17 terabyte drive. You know. So a petabyte drive, we're out there, but it's going to be a thing that everybody's going to use here soon. So all those images you take in the future, it's not going to be a problem for you to store. The other issue is overhead duty cycle. You know, even though we take exposure, there's a little bit of time lapse between when it takes and it downloads your computer. Once we figure that overhead out, it'll happen, and the cameras will be faster. It'll be much more reasonable to do that. You know, thousands and thousands of exposures, getting a nice galaxy image. And then AI is a thing here, and AI and noise reduction algorithms are really going to come into light and really help us do a lot of the auto things that we have to manually do now. Right now, we have some great AI apps that get rid of a lot of noise in our images. And in the future, it'll be doing a lot more. So if you want to look up some references of where I got all this information from, that's it there. If you haven't seen, if you're an imager and you want to read more about noise or look up Dr. Robbie Glover on, just Google him. He's got a wonderful YouTube video out there that shows you this whole process of how to figure out your exposure time. And it works 100% of the time. So, thanks for that, and I will leave it here. If there's any questions from anybody, I'll be happy to answer them before I move on to the next one.